I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcome to a new episode of To the Contrary podcast. We survived the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, and I'm really pleased to be joined once again by my good friend Nicholas Grossman, who is the editor of Arc Digital and a professor of political science at the University of Illinois. Welcome back, Nicholas.
Thanks. Happy to be with you.
Well, I want to talk about, I know that you focus a lot on international relations. I want to talk about Ukraine. I want to talk about the tariff fight. But can we just start off with the elections in Canada a couple of days ago? Because that was truly extraordinary, wasn't it? The Liberal Party was absolutely dead, written off, buried, resurrected by Donald Trump, in effect. So Donald Trump has managed to completely tank the Conservatives' hopes. I mean, the Conservatives were basically almost assured of winning that election in Canada a few months ago, and they lost. So talk to me about that, because I'm trying to think of the last time that an American politician or president had that kind of an influence on Canadian politics, if ever.
I can't think of a single time. I actually can't think of a single election anywhere where something like this has happened, that the Liberal Party had been in power for a while. They usually had the anti-incumbency stuff against them. They were trailing in polls by about 20 points, and everyone had written them off. And then Trump starts with the Canada 51st state and other threats, and starts with tariffs. And the then Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, stood up to it. And then he stepped down, and Mark Carney took the spot, who just got reelected as Prime Minister. And he stood up to it, and they shot up in the polls. And the Conservatives then were caught somewhat flat-footed, because they have a base that likes a lot of the Trump stuff. And then a bunch of what you might call normal mainstream Canadian Conservatives who have basic national pride and who don't want to be treated like that, and then who ended up flocking back to the Liberals and back to Carney. And I don't think there's been any election, at least not that I can think of, where threats from a foreign country then rapidly flipped the outcome of an election that looked almost certain. And if anything, this is a maybe saving grace in that smarter move, kind of, if we had smarter fascists, the move would have been to stay out of the Canadian election, wait until a sympathetic person wins as the polls were going, and then try to make them like, I don't know, what Hitler did to Austria or what Putin has done to Belarus, or a North American version of that. And instead, Trump just, I guess, couldn't help himself, making it about himself. Even the morning of the election, he did another like a 51st state, they're so excited thing. Even as the Conservatives were saying, please don't make this about you, stay out of it.
And yet he succeeded in tanking the Conservatives. So, for the people who are always thinking that there's a plan, you just need to follow the plan. There's, four-dimensional chess. There was none. It was completely self-destructive. And by the way, since we're on all of this, and I'm reluctant to spend too much time on polls, but there's a couple of interesting polls that I wanted to ask you about. Here's the new Washington Post ABC poll that came out on Tuesday afternoon. Most Americans take Trump's Canada, Greenland, and third-term ideas seriously and oppose them. See, this is one of the big questions, is whether or not people actually believe that Donald Trump is going to do what he says. Now, in the past, there's been a long pattern of people, Trump saying outrageous things, and a very large number of voters thinking, well, he doesn't mean it, or he's joking, or I don't care. But there seems to be kind of a shift where people are now saying, you know what, a lot of the things that he's saying seem real. So first of all, do you take the Canada, Greenland, third term ideas seriously? Because I'm moving on the third term, thinking that he's much more serious about it. Where do you come down on this?
Oh, very much so. So I think any of the third term talk is a very easy one, in that we already saw him and the people around him try to keep power illegally when they were legally required to leave. And I see no reason why we should assume that they will willingly give up power this time just because the law requires them to do so. So I expect him to lie and come up with who knows what rationale, but just assert it and get more and more of the Republican Party on board, much as he was able to do with getting them more on board with excusing or even defending January 6th, for example. With a lot of the foreign threats, I think it is serious whether or not the United States is really going to follow through. That whatever action they do, it makes sense to take it seriously, in part because Trump likes to float ideas and kind of see what the public reaction is. And so if more of the public either shrugs or is enthusiastic, if more of his base is enthusiastic, that makes it more likely to actually happen. But also because things like national security take long-term planning, that countries like Denmark or Canada or Panama have to readjust their plans to
Right.
account for the ways that the United States might be threatening. So even if the US doesn't follow through, even if Trump is just, let's just say hypothetically, he's just saying a lot just kind of to be an asshole and put on a show and
Yeah.
maybe get a tariff deal or something. Even if he's doing that, the difference between going from trust that is completely taken for granted because it's been going for decades and is so robust into a lack of trust, like with Canada, a good example of this is North American Air Command is joint Canadian and United States. It's not just the US. This is how we deal with air threats coming from, for example, Russia or over the Arctic Circle. And the Canadians can't really trust the United States on that anymore. And so they're going to start making different plans, and they're going to hesitate to share information. And they're probably doing this already. And so it is serious, even if it goes no further, which it could. And I don't see why anybody would just assume that it'll be fine, because a lot of things that people said, oh, he'll never do that, he's done. And so they should take this seriously too.
No, and I think this is an important point that certainly one of the legacies of that first 100 days is the shattering of many of our alliances, and that much of the rest of the world, some of our closest allies, are no longer feel that they can rely on or trust the United States, and it's hard to put that together. It's hard to replace that level of trust. And I'm trying to think of the analogy that David Frum used. I mean, the first time that Donald Trump was elected, you might think that it's just simply a fluke and things are going to go back to normal. But the fact that now that he's back in power, people are realizing there's a pattern. America has a problem. We cannot rely on swing voters in Wisconsin every 4 years to secure our national security. We're going to have to move on. But the other thing that's interesting about these polls, though, is that there was a conventional wisdom that Donald Trump was going to be very, very strong on two big issues, the economy and immigration. Let's start with immigration. That even if he was cruel and lawless in his mass deportations, that this was kind of his sweet spot. But there's growing indication that he's underwater on these issues. Most voters now have had a number of polls showing that they disapprove of his of his handling of the case of the Maryland man who was renditioned to El Salvador, including when it comes to sending U.S. citizens convicted of violent crimes to prisons in other countries. 71% of Americans think, yeah, Donald Trump is serious about that, and yet they oppose it by rather strong margins. The idea. We also have an Axios poll showing that most Americans now see Trump as a dangerous dictator, which is remarkable. So I guess that what I wanted to ask you is the cognitive dissonance. All of these things were brought up during the campaign. People made the warnings. Democrats litigated the issue of tariffs, I think, rather aggressively, said it was a tax, it would be inflationary. Voters shrugged it off. They voted for Donald Trump. But now they seem to be taking it more seriously. What are you seeing happening here?
I think for a lot of the voters, they either bought into some of his lies or the way he was selling it and the way other people around him were selling it. So on immigration, for example, the pitch was not, we're going to grab a bunch of innocent, either, U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents, green card holders, or other people who have all their papers in order. We're going to just grab them off the street and throw them in some foreign gulag without due process. That was not the pitch. The pitch was that he was going to go after criminals and remove all these dangerous criminals. And they're even still trying to cling to this. You might have seen the White House put out a row of mugshots of
Yes.
just on the front of the White House lawn.
Yard signs.
Yes, yard signs. It's pretty gross. And as people noticed that look closely, they don't really have the names or alleged crimes on them. So people can't fact check it. It is just a bunch of photos of scary looking Latino men. And this in part strikes me as a sign of desperation, that they thought this was going to go better and are trying to remind people of what the original pitch was. And that isn't working well when it comes to people who, one, are seem to be innocent, don't seem to have committed a crime, that have things like an American spouse or have a kid who's an American
Right.
citizen. And so that wasn't who they were. We get a lot of positive things from the community. That isn't who people
Yeah.
pictured that were going. And the idea of innocent until proven guilty is one of the oldest, most core American principles. And seeing people then denied due process, and even having the government assert we don't give them any due process, or the only due process they get is being removed. And that's like, well, then how do you know that they're actually a criminal? And so that seems to be resonating more. One that struck me was where Joe Rogan was talking about Kilmer Abrego
Yeah.
Garcia and saying a similar thing about like, well, can't you put him on trial and show the stuff that supposedly
Right. That's the
that he
point,
did
right?
wrong, and then you can get him out. And so even someone who was a Trump at least soft supporter early on is starting to ask those questions. It's not that he's turning on Trump entirely or saying the whole thing is bad, but it is showing that when they go against these core American principles, things that are literally in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, when they go against that they anger a bunch more people, or they make some people wake up a little and say, oh, this wasn't what I voted for, this wasn't what I planned on, or just not liking it in a visceral reaction. And the more and more that adds up, the harder it is for them to operate. Although they might
But I don't.
also end up getting more desperate and drastic.
Well, that's right, and I think that we need to realize that as bad as the last 100 days was, the worst may be yet to come, because they now have the infrastructure in place, and we know that they have a playbook. But let's go back to this the reaction on due process, because I'm not sure that was a given. I worried about that. I've seen people on the right, when they push law and order, um, just gloss over many of those civil liberties. And the concept of due process is an abstraction. And one of the things we've learned over the last couple of years is sometimes how thin on the ground many of those abstractions, those norms are. And so Donald Trump, I think, was counting on this. He was basically saying, look, these are bad guys. You don't actually care how we deal with them, how brutal we are, how cruel we are, whether they get trials or not. And so in many ways, it's one of those, it feels like a rather rare surprise in public opinion to realize that there is that reservoir of belief and commitment to those, as you put it, these fundamental American values, these fundamental, what does it mean to be an American? It means the government cannot snatch you off the street, put you on a plane, and send you to a gulag without a trial. And it seems kind of fundamental, right? And yet
It
Donald Trump
does.
thought, and he probably still thinks he's going to get away with that.
I think so, but I think a big part of the difference, and you're right about the defending an abstract principle, but a big part of what happened here was that it moved from abstraction to real human beings, and
Yes.
this is sort of another theme of maybe a saving grace of this is we could have had smarter fascists, that if they had gone after people who really were criminal, or really were
Right,
bad, and
right.
had somehow just sort of skirted the law a bit. And instead of having to do this absurd stretch of where Garcia is MS-13 because he wore some Chicago Bulls gear, and then anybody who wears Chicago Bulls gear thinks, if they hear about it, oh wait, that could happen to me. And with some of the foreign students, the video of the student named whose last name Ozturk in
Yeah.
the Tough student, and a video
Yes.
went all around the internet of something that a lot of people thought did not happen in America. That's the sort of thing, that happens in dictatorships elsewhere over
Yeah.
there, and that
You're
makes it more
snatched off the
visceral,
street,
more
look like a
personal.
kidnapping. Okay, so
Exactly.
this is a really important point, and I do think that it is one of the things that's shaping the new dynamic, is the fact that there are stories that when we talk on the plane of issues, Donald Trump can talk about we need to get the bad guys out and everything and whatever. But now we're starting to see these tangible stories. There's a human face on these cases, and I sense that not just on the issue of immigration, but on a lot of the issues, because in Trump 1.0, there was a lot of controversy in Washington, D.C., but it didn't really trickle down into people's lives until COVID, of course. Um, and so I saw one analysis, I think it was on CNN, that at this time in Trump's first term, the most Googled term was Twitter. People want to know, what is Donald Trump doing on Twitter? Now, the most Googled term related to Donald Trump is tariffs. So people are being impacted. They know people who have lost their jobs or are affected by various cutbacks. people are thinking, okay, what's going to happen to Social Security? What happened to this family that lives down the street? And I think that's, I'm looking at some of these numbers, and you get a sense that people are paying attention to those human details, and it's not playing the way that he thought. And again, that was not necessarily a given the media climate that we have. But it does seem these stories are breaking through. Like, for example, it's interesting how people will spontaneously bring up the fact that these small children who are American citizens are being shipped out of the country, even though some of them might be suffering from cancer. The family separations. This really hits people on a visceral level.
I'm a parent. I feel it.
Yeah.
That I mean, some in the first term also, but the kid deporting a kid who has cancer and not even making sure he could get his medication on the way. That just an unnecessarily cruel thing. That on top of other cruelty that resonates with people. I think also on the public opinion that it helps quite a bit that there is no longer a Democratic president to bash and blame a lot of things on. There's no
Right.
longer a campaign and people choosing sides and where it's almost like go support your team. That it is just do you approve or disapprove of the president? That
Yeah.
also the policies are so clearly different. And the biggest one where I expect a lot of this to hit is the economy and it is the tariffs. So you mentioned right the way that people are starting to notice them, but
Right.
that hasn't really hit yet. That's the sort of thing that is going to in the next probably few months cause price increases, maybe have some empty shelves
Right.
in stores, have people waiting on goods or having supply chain crunch in a way that they didn't experience since 2020. And those are also the sort of things that where they are unignorable because they're happening directly to people. It's not like you said, just an abstraction in Washington. This is a my life got noticeably worse. And the obvious explanation, and granted, some people will deny this, but the obvious explanation is it got worse because the president did it, which also has the benefit of being true that he did.
But the president said he was going to do it. I mean, this is the where we have the cognitive dissonance where this came up over and over and over again. Anyone who's followed Donald Trump for the last 30 years know that he has a fetish for tariffs. I mean, the one time that I spoke with him back in 2016, he was talking about a trade war with China. He brought this up. The Democrats made an issue of it. So why was that not a decisive issue in 2024? Did people just not back then? Were people in sort of a delusion of normalcy that he says lots of stuff, but it's not actually going to happen, and now it's really happening? Is that what's going
I
on
think
here?
so.
I mean, what
I think that's part of
yeah,
it. I think that a lot of it is also an example of an abstraction and who was saying what. So
yeah,
Trump didn't sell people on. He might say, "I'll do tariffs," but it was always, "I'm going to do tariffs and everything will be cheaper and all these jobs will come
right,
back and
right,
you'll get all these other benefits and we're going to make so much money and I'm going to cut your taxes as a result." And so it was all a lie. But the people who were saying otherwise were either Democratic politicians or hated media figures or egghead professors or others that are
right,
all stupid and wrong about everything. And so if you
yeah,
take that as an attitude, then it was the experts having a lot of data and explaining why it wasn't going to work. And it was a politician, charismatic politician in Donald Trump
mhm,
selling people what was a fantasy. And I had discussions. I remember one where I was chastised for when I explained tariffs make things more expensive that a woman got angry at me and said, well, maybe, but he's going to cut energy costs in half, and that's going to make all the costs go down. And how do you not
wow,
understand this? You're so stupid. And I didn't really have much of a response to this. I mean, I think I said something about how long oil projects take to get going, or how the United States is already the world's leading oil producer,
yeah,
that had been going up under Joe Biden, so that wasn't a problem. It doesn't affect energy costs right away, but that sort of thing was not an emotional argument that I think in her situation, she wanted to believe. She liked the story of I'm going to get you something for nothing. I'm going to wave some magic wand, and then things will suddenly get better for you in all of these great ways. And didn't want to think maybe too hard about what the alternative is. And no, I could never figure out. Maybe it's a flaw in me. Maybe it's people I was talking to, but I can never figure out a way to convince somebody like that.
I
Even
don't
though
know
I
that
had,
there is one.
facts and evidence and truth on my side, I don't know how
Well,
to do that except for the, analogy of touch the stove.
Facts, evidence, and truth. That's so old school. That feels like so last century. Well, I have to tell, I mean, I think the entire business community just talked themselves into believing that he was bluffing, that this was just a negotiating ploy, and there was no way that he would actually do it, or that if he did it, it would be in a targeted way. Nobody thought that he would go, hog wild on the tax and that the tariffs just throwing him up. And by the way, speaking of like facts and logic, can you make this make sense for me, Nicholas? On the one hand, he's saying that that we're going to come up with deals so that we're going to, obviously, which would mean that we would remove some of the tariffs or lower some of the tariffs, right? If you actually strike a deal, that these are basically just cudgels. And yet at the same time, he's saying that the revenue from the tariffs will be so great that we can, have this massive cut in the income tax. Now, first of all, the math doesn't add up, to be able to cut the income tax, but also he's basically arguing that two completely contradictory things. We're either going to have such massive tariffs going forward forever that they replace the individual income tax, or we're going to be negotiating them and striking deals. So, can you make it make sense for me?
Sure, that seems like a lot of what Trump does. Is it's something for
Yeah.
nothing, have your cake and eat it too,
Yes.
and not a genuine argument in the sense that maybe you or I might make of trying to convince people. In which case, we try to be consistent and use the same evidence in when we argue with various people. But instead, just more like a salesman pitch of what is it that you want to hear? Well, I'll give you a
Right.
bunch of things, and you
That's
can,
easy.
as long as you want to support me, you can kind of pick which one sounds good to you. And then when you get into arguments with people, you can say whatever, oh, we're going to make so much money, or oh, we're going to bring jobs back, or one or the other. What I find so striking, say, with a lot of the deals is, or a lot of the tariffs, is get the sense that what they thought was going to happen, or what he thought was going to happen, was there would be at least some that would do the, oh, sir, whatever you want, we're so scared,
Yes.
please don't hurt me. And not really thinking that other countries had, same thing with Canada, for example, not really thinking other countries had agency and have nationalism and have pride, and
Their own
that government
politics.
leaders won't want to look weak to their people, and in fact will want to stand up to foreign bullying. And even for the matter that trade deals take a long time to negotiate, that there's no possible way to get something like 90 trade deals in a short amount of time. And this isn't even really shouldn't be a surprise, because a similar, albeit smaller version happened in the first term of that. We had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a trade deal with 12
Hmm.
countries, took about 6 years to negotiate. It was all these Pacific Rim countries, and it excluded China. It was a good long term
Right.
China containment strategy. And he called it a terrible deal, and he got into office, and he got rid of it, and he promised I'm going to get better deals with all these other countries one on one, and he got literally zero. And where that takes us now is a country, good example, I think, of this is Vietnam, where Vietnam has been a very pro American country, especially this century. A lot of that is because they're frightened of China and would rather deal with the US. And when Trump put tariffs on Vietnam, which already has very low tariffs with the US, they announced very quickly, we'll do zero. We'll do zero right away, 0%. And
Yeah.
the response from the Treasury Secretary was to treat it as an insult and say, like, oh, that doesn't really matter. What we're worried
What?
about is all this other non-tariff cheating. And the Vietnamese don't know what to do about that because they're not cheating in any particular way. And it looks like, if you look into it, it's the fact that the United States buys more from Vietnam than Vietnam buys from the United States, which is not inherently bad. It means Americans want to buy things like, I don't know, Vietnamese rubber. And then just that week after Trump rejected them, Vietnam signed a supply chain and production agreement with China. So it doesn't mean that they are about to become a close Chinese ally, but we had Trump's time in office took Vietnam from a pro American country that really wanted to work with the US and not work with China into
Yeah.
one that is now has no idea how to deal with US hostility, and so is warming up to China in response.
I, I think one of the real shocks that people in the business community are experiencing is realizing that, I mean, they were absolutely sure that Donald Trump was going to be the most pro business, pro growth president ever, and now they're starting to realize that he fundamentally does not understand economics. He does not understand how international trade works, and he doesn't even understand the entire concept of imbalance of trade. Right, that trade deficits, are somehow robbing us, robbing Americans of wealth, when in fact that's not what it is at all. So his lack of understanding of the basics, I think, is kind of breathtaking and has contributed to kind of the intake of breath of a lot of these guys who now are faced with the maximum uncertainty of an economy that is run by the whim of one man.
I'm amazed at the groupthink that they managed to get
Yes.
to, where they convince themselves that he's a businessman, he thinks like me, all that stuff
Right.
he's saying is just for the rubes. And
Yes.
at some level, I mean, who's the rube now, guys?
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you had somebody like Jamie Dimon, the head of CEO of JP Morgan, who was a Trump booster in the
Yeah.
election, and then who in January, February was saying like, "Oh, tariffs, everybody get over it," and now
Yeah.
is saying like, "Oh, actually, I think we've reanalyzed what we expect, and or now growth expectations are zero or negative, and we're expecting inflation and all these other problems." And if anything, it reminds me of the stupid groupthink that they had in the 2000s, of where they convinced themselves that housing would never go down, and that
Yep.
various derivatives and complex financial instruments had defeated risk, and so there was really no risk of what they were doing. And they crashed global economy with this. And similarly here, they really did seem to tell themselves just Trump will do what I would do in office, and not listen to the things he said many, many times that he would do, and which he also then did some of in his first term. And yet still they told himself, I guess maybe tempted by a tax cut or regulation cuts,
A
who
little bit.
knows? But yeah, either way, just went with it. And I'm kind of floored by that one. It's amazing that these ostensibly smart, sophisticated investors made this sort of a mistake.
I think the key word is ostensibly. I think part of the problem is that at a certain point you develop this excessive confidence in your own talents. I mean, Elon Musk being a pretty good example. I mean, he has skills in certain areas, and then you put him in charge of slashing government, and you realize the limited transferability of some of those skills. Okay, I want to get to, because I know that I want to tap your expertise about what's going on with Ukraine and some other things. But one last question on the tariffs: that the actual impact has really not hit us yet, right? But we are seeing stories. We started to see stories in the last week or so about the empty container ships coming from China, and the reports out of the West Coast ports that they are expecting massive drops in imports. And I think I saw a statement from the International Longshoremen, the union, opposing the tariffs. But you feel, I mean, what does it look like to you? It looks like it feels like kind of this reverse tsunami, where the goods that we would normally have coming into the country are not going to be here. These ports are not going to see these products, so that we're when is this going to hit?
So I've been feeling this vibe that reminds me of kind of how I felt in January and February 2020, of so COVID hadn't really made it here. It was
Yeah,
March
right,
that it really
right,
broke
right.
here. But it was in a number of other
But it's
countries. And
coming.
I remember talking to people who, I was telling people to buy toilet paper, and I remember some, like, "Oh, that's not going to happen," or, "Oh, come on, we're not Iran, we're not South Korea, well, we're not China, what do you think is going to happen?" And just kind of waiting. And I remember saying, it's like, no, the virus is already here, just people haven't realized it yet. It just hasn't spread enough for that to be clear. And I'm not saying it's identical, obviously no pandemic here, but economically somewhat similar, in that the number of
Yeah,
container ships that were arriving from China at major ports like Los Angeles and Seattle
yeah.
are going to dry up almost entirely within a week or two. And that means I've seen the numbers upwards of a million or more contracts with or truck routes, that so those containers go from the ships and they go onto a semi truck. And so those
Oh,
trucks are out of business, and the people who are relying on that either for consumption at a store, or for
yeah.
especially something like inputs into any other sort of business, that's just kind of not going to be there. And on top of that, we can pile things like the economic effects of the mass firings from Doge and others. And both of those should, plus all the chaos that is causing an attacks on rule of law, that's causing more loss of confidence in the United States. And all of that combined should hit in not that long. I mean, I'm not going to give you an exact number, because who knows when the tsunami is probably makes a lot of sense of the
Yeah.
earthquake has already happened, just the wave
You're
hasn't
right.
really made it here yet.
Yeah.
And I am expecting that pretty soon, and that with the container ships and the loss of products on shelves and products and inputs being the one that should become really evident within probably about 2-3 weeks.
You know what really worries me about that is that if things really get bad, knowing Donald Trump, and you really do understand Donald Trump's style and his psychology and his playbook, that if things really get bad, Donald Trump will reach for a bigger distraction. He will come up with something different. The assumption that somehow crisis brings Donald Trump down, that may be true, but it also makes him more dangerous. You and I were just briefly before we started talking, taping today, talked about one of his more recent executive orders, which would basically empower or encourage the military to get involved in law enforcement. And this has always been sort of hanging out there as kind of the ultimate authoritarian nightmare. But right from the beginning, Donald Trump has made a priority to get control of the military, personal control of the military. We have laws and traditions and norms that keep the active military off the streets as much as possible of our cities. Give me some sense of what you think is happening there.
So the order is somewhat ambiguous, as I think, somewhat confusing, as I think a lot of these sometimes, tend to be. And though, as I read it, it, among other things, instructs the Secretary of Defense to put together different ways for U.S. military, both assets, equipment, and also personnel, to be able to help in what the language of the order is, preventing crime. And I don't really know what that means or what that would mean. In a that's not really what the military does. The way that you could, you can maybe stop crime, perhaps, or say catch somebody, but preventing is that and then deploy all around the streets and walk patrols and stuff like that. And it seemed also like they would put them under the purview of the Attorney General, and the military doesn't work for DOJ. It likely violates passe comitas, the law that says the military can't operate on the soil, U.S. soil. That's a very old law. Although the Trump administration has tried different ways of getting around that, or claiming things like this, similar to what they did with the Alien Enemies Act, to claim justification for deportation.
And they do have the Insurrection Act in their pocket, and there are very few checks on that if he decides to invoke that. Correct?
Yes. So, and there's also the problem that if he invokes it and gives an order, even if it's not a legal use of the law, at minimum, by the time that would get a potential court rebuke, it could already be underway and already be happening.
Right.
I can do sort of bigger fears, long-term fears, is that questions like when faced with a legal order, will they follow it? If some of them don't follow it and others do, that's extremely dangerous. That's a potential for politicizing the military. The real nightmare scenario, splitting the military over something like this. Depends on how far he would go. I think that's decently farther down the line. But I've thought I think in particular since 2020 and reactions to Black Lives Matter protests, that Trump has been itching to use force and to order use of force against protesters. Nope. And you mentioned things he's been saying for a long time, right, with tariffs. There's also his infamous words about Tiananmen Square in the protests, about how much he admired that China put it down with so much force and so ruthlessly, how strong he thought that was. And you can hear similar admiration for Putin and the repression there. And he talks very positively about Kim Jong-un. So these are very repressive dictators who put down any sort of dissent with force. And I think he's been at least itching to try that. And the real open question is, what will the military do? That I do not think that all of the most senior officers are going to want to do this. I expect at least some of them are going to go to lawyers and come back saying, I'm sorry, that's an illegal order, I can't follow it.
But he's fired the lawyers too.
Yeah, you can always fire
One
more
of the first
people.
things he did was he fired the lawyers.
Oh, that's right. Fire the JAGs. Yeah, fire the military lawyers. That's right. So that they don't have people saying that.
The reason I'm bringing this up is because, you want to talk about a dark scenario, that we need to understand that, the Supreme Court does not have its own army. The Congress does not have an army. Most of what we think of as the democracy movement doesn't have an army. Donald Trump has an army now. And I think we need to understand the asymmetry that if things really, really go south, how bad things could be. And I've talked about this with others, including, I think it was Ryan Lizard the other day, our failure of imagination about what Donald Trump is capable of doing, what he wants to do, even though Trump makes it clear what he wants to do, what he is itching to do, and yet people are shocked when he does it. But obviously he is fixated on the use of the military, the use of force, looking strong, and that he's going to be absolutely tumescent when he has this giant military parade in Washington, D.C. on his birthday, right? So, this is something that is, he has a number of obsessions, and this is one of them.
Yeah, I think that the failure of imagination has been one of the big running problems, the sort of, it can't happen here complacency.
Right.
It'll be fine, somebody will stop it. and we keep on seeing, okay, who, who will actually stop it? And so, if anything, I think maybe this is me having national security brain, but that the way I've been trained to think about stuff like, say, terrorism, is to look for what they call low probability, high impact events. Meaning, if it would
Hmm.
be a really big deal if it happens, and it is possible to happen, we should take it seriously. And so,
Yeah.
by that standard, if I had to ballpark, what are the chances that Trump orders the use of force against peaceful protesters in the United States? I mean,
I,
way higher than like the 1 or 2% that would cross that threshold of low probability. We need to take it seriously. A lot higher than that, and I see no reason not to assume that he might. If anything, I think it's been the opposite problem, that people assuming that they can. Well, someone like those Wall Street guys, no, he won't, or never do it, or someone will stop, or any of those
I
other
completely agree.
complacent assumptions, and I don't do that.
Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about what's going on with Ukraine. We had the last weekend. We had the funeral of the Pope. Donald Trump goes there and has that remarkable 15-minute sit down with Volodymyr Zelensky for the very, very first time. You got the little bit of criticism of Vladimir Putin that maybe he doesn't want peace, but at the same time, Marco Rubio is out there saying we may just walk away from the whole peace process. So where are we at right now? Because up until this weekend, it was very, very clear that Donald Trump has completely aligned his rhetoric and his positions with that of the Kremlin. And yet Vladimir Putin feels like he's playing with him, that he's not giving him the win. He's not allowing him to come out of this with some sort of a face-saving deal. So what is the state of play, Nicholas?
I think it's basically the same in that the fundamental fact of this war that a lot of people have either been in denial about or just sort of refuse to recognize is that it is Russian aggression. And so the real implications of that, that Putin attacked, he didn't have to. And, he ordered the troops to invade, certainly didn't have to do that. He can order them to stop at any point and hasn't. And there has been this misnomer among, I think, decent amount of, Trump. Musk has made these arguments, a lot of the MAGA right, and also some of the left that people like, well, Pope Francis was one who said this, and Lula da Silva of Brazil, and maybe American thinkers like, say, Noam Chomsky
Mm.
had argued that they're treating the war as if it is somehow America's fault or it's Ukraine's fault for resisting, but basically assuming that Putin wants peace. And so that when you say something like, oh, we're going to get the Ukrainians to stop fighting, that as if they're expecting a reaction that Putin's going to say, oh, thank God, finally we can stop this devastating war. I'm so upset about all these people dying. Great, I will make some concessions. If you give me some concessions, let's make a deal. And instead, the way that he thinks is, oh, look at them willing to compromise. They're weak. They're coming to me because they're weak. If we just push harder, if we push harder, they're going to fold and I'm going to get it all. And this makes people uncomfortable that to deal with a murderous dictator out for conquest simply because he wants it. That's mine and I want it. And I don't care who I kill on my side or the other in order to get it. And that, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. A lot of people thought that was left behind in history. That's very 20th century. We read about that. We don't experience it. And so whenever the approach, even if say, I'll give Trump and team the benefit of the doubt on this one. Even if we do that, then they're going into it thinking that they're going to get Putin this favor, and so he's going to want to do them a favor back.
Right.
But they're doing him a favor, even if they don't totally realize it, or whether or not they do. But they're doing him a favor by weakening the Ukrainians and by showing less U.S. support for Ukraine and Europe, and that ends up then encouraging Russia more. That is what they wanted. That's what they were banking on with the U.S. election. That's why I think when there was possibilities of negotiations in 2023, 2024, why Russia was so adamantly against them and or would undermine them and with bad faith, in part because they saw this lifeline of maybe America will flip. And so there's no particular reason why they would stop. I heard Marco Rubio made this statement about how it's like yesterday, these innocent children were killed in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and we need this war to stop. And I thought about, it, I was like, that's not quite right, Mr. Secretary of State. The people didn't just die like it was from a hurricane or some sort of natural disaster. Russia killed them, and Russia targeted civilians on purpose, and it did it because it's trying to conquer Ukraine. And they want the Ukrainians to surrender and to bow down to them. And of course, the Ukrainians don't want to do that. And Americans of all people should understand why, no, we're not going to bow down to a foreign dictator, give me liberty or give me death, and that attitude. would make perfect sense that the Ukrainians are choosing that on their own. But the conspiracy theory about it was the Americans tricked them into it somehow, that they wouldn't want to resist on their own. They're only doing it at the behest of the United States. So as soon as the United States stops the warmongering Ukrainians, who are just defending themselves, then there'll be peace. And as long as that is the American attitude towards the war, then there won't be peace, or there'll be, at least, they're going to fight it out for a bunch longer. And part of the problem is this means then what's the strategy have to be? How do you get Russia to change its mind and to agree to some sort of peace deal, or just to unilaterally withdraw, or for its military to collapse? And the only answer to that is to help Ukraine resist them more, to thwart the Russian military's advances, to make them spend resources, to do as the Ukrainians have increasingly been doing, striking inside Russia, especially at military and related industry, munitions factories, drone factories, oil depots, things like that, and make it that Russia either cannot make war anymore or reaches a point where it decides it's no longer worth it anymore. And that is not a pleasant thing. It's not a quick ending. It's not a relatively low cost ending, but it is the only way to deal with aggression, as history has told us many times before.
So what's going to happen with Donald Trump, though? Is that I think you could make the case that among all the people that are dealing with Donald Trump, that Vladimir Putin is the only one who really seems to understand how to deal with the bully. Everybody else is bending the knee. It's like, oh, we have to be nice to Donald Trump. We have to give Donald Trump everything he wants. And Vladimir Putin, who Donald Trump thinks is his good buddy, is kind of humiliating him in public. So is there some breaking point where Donald Trump says, you know what, you're playing me, you're insulting me, you're not my friend, I'm not going to, turn over Ukraine? Or is he just stuck? Where do you think? I mean, where is he going to go on all of this? Because he has no emotional attachment. Yeah. Okay, what do you mean?
I think it's completely stuck. I also just want to say on the other people, perhaps not pushing back on him, that there have been a few, we mentioned Canadians earlier. Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico is another one who just sort of given a no, and some domestic institutions in one way or another. I'd say something like Harvard, for example, recently telling them no in a way that Columbia University did not, and that's very helpful.
Some of the big law firms. Yeah.
Some of them, right? Not others, but some. And those ones that did agree to do the pro bono work under bullying are going to find themselves defending things like, say, military officers that ordered people to fire on civilians in the United States, something like that, which I don't know if they realize they signed up for. But with Putin, I think that Trump is all in on this, that it's been, whether how much element of psychological or the idea of losing face, of he has committed so much to this for so many years, so consistently, that he cannot possibly back off in any way while accepting exactly what Putin's doing to him, or taking it as some sort of personal insult, and without losing an immense amount of face, or maybe even his sense of self. That this was one of the things I thought was so weird about the fantasies of people before the election of, he'll be tougher on Putin, he'll help the Ukrainians because he loves deals, and he'll be embarrassed if he doesn't get a good one. And no, he just really has affinity for Russia. Or heard a similar one of, he's going to be so much tougher on Netanyahu in Israel because, otherwise Netanyahu will embarrass him. And it's no. Yes. He agrees, or if anything, he wants, Netanyahu to do it more. And so he'll never drop them. This is why you see people, both Trump himself and others like Rubio or Hegseth, they are working to try to blame the Ukrainians, to try to blame the Europeans. The fact that even Zelensky got Trump to acknowledge maybe Putin isn't, interested in ending the war, seems more like one of those Trump infamously agreeing with whoever he spoke to last, rather than something that would actually change U.S. policy. I don't think there's any way around it. The way he'll do it is the same thing he does with pretty much every foreign policy, including the tariffs, is that the first goal for him always is to lie to the American people and try to make himself look good. And after that, maybe some of the actual policy might matter. But I expect him to bail.
But did you see the editorial in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday? I mean, when you lose Rupert Murdoch, and they're saying, Trump 2.0 is in trouble. And I thought the editorial was going to be about the tariffs, but it really zeroed in on, the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan really was a tipping point for the Biden presidency. A cataclysm in Ukraine could do the same thing for you, and you are so narrowly focused on this, Russia first policy. So you have people on the right who are now warning him that there's significant risk and downside if you abandon Ukraine and Vladimir Putin goes in there and the world sees those pictures. Do you think that has any influence on him whatsoever?
Honestly, probably no. One,
Yeah.
if Wall Street Journal and other bankers can't get him to reduce the tariffs and
Yeah.
help the economy, I don't know how they're going to get him to change stances
It's
on
hard to
foreign
argue with
policy.
that. Hmm.
Two, because actually doing something about the war is hard, and just kind of bailing on it and blaming other people is easy. And three, because one of the larger problems, and you mentioned very early in the discussion about how the with the first term that was sort of our mulligan. That was the, oh, it'll just blow over. It's just a fluke.
Right.
And that now the
Right.
message to the world is this could happen every 4 years. That just,
Right.
you're relying on the whims of American voters. It's not going to be, the institutions can't contain it. And so this is just another example of that. I think that one of the things Trump absorbed and a lot of his people learned was that the experts who say stuff like that are wrong. So you think of how many people told him that if you I don't know, if you commit these blatant crimes, you're not going to get reelected. If you you should take something, you should take one, like on the classified documents case, take the avenue that people like Mike Pence and Hillary Clinton did of go, oops, my bad, and return it, and then they won't
Easy.
prosecute
Yeah.
you. But no,
Right.
because otherwise you'll lose. And they say this over and over again. And the result was not Trump losing, and it was him regaining power despite going that way. And so they seem to be operating more with those people don't know what they're talking about. They're just weak, or they're scared, they're holding me back, and they can't do anything about it anyway. So I don't expect that. The Wall Street Journal talked to him. If anything, now he's talking about, how Rupert Murdoch lost his way, or trying to
Right.
bully
Right.
Fox, bully Wall Street Journal, bully the New York Post into saying something different.
The,
And is his move pretty much all the time. Just, bluster more, bully more. And there are some things you can maybe get to do it, like maybe some law firms or maybe some media organizations, but others that you can't. And that includes Russia and Ukraine and Europe. It seems to include China, for that matter, Canada and Mexico, and especially including the bond market. You can't just yell at the bond market and get people to take their money and trust that the United States will be reliable enough to loan the US money, that they just simply put their money somewhere else. And so
there's a
yelling at
reality
it won't
check.
change it, but they're doing it anyway.
So let's go back to where we started with looking at some of these polls. Does it actually matter that public opinion is shifting against him? Now, I'm not saying will it matter to Donald Trump, but just in overall in drawing lines, containing him, strengthening guardrails. Does this shift in public opinion matter? Because so far, I mean, the big caveat here is you're not seeing any elected Republicans really, peeling off. He still has solid support. So even if there is a coming blue wave in 2026, it certainly seems in the interim as if congressional Republicans are absolutely content to be potted plants and absolute Trump loyalists. So what is the significance of the public opinion? Or are we in an era where it doesn't really change anything? What do you think?
I think it matters. I think it matters more than many anticipate, or many assume. That not really because of the congressional Republicans. I think you're right. I have no
Mhm.
faith in them to do anything to stand up for the Constitution at all. If anything, I thought January 6th was the line for that. If you would go along with that, you'll go
Right.
along with anything.
Sure.
And I still can't believe that Mike Pence's brother voted for it, even after they tried to
I
kill
know.
Mike Pence. That where I have brothers,
Brothers.
I'd like to think that they would not vote for people who tried to kill me. Um, but
You
so I
would,
have no
yeah.
faith in them. And on top of even just the political incentives, so they don't seem to either, have principles, or at least have the spine to back those principles up if they have them. And politically, they are more afraid of Republican primaries than they are of general elections. That
Yep.
even in worst case scenario for them, right? They win the primary, they lose the general election. Well, then as long as you stuck by Trump, then you can get a media
Right.
contract or a consulting
Right.
job or something. And so I don't really expect them to change there. But the public opinion is a hard to really, we can measure it, in numbers, but hard to really determine the effect, but is always having an effect on politics. That more entrenched authoritarians than this one have fallen. And the way that they fall is by losing a lot of the public. That you get more people, courage can be contagious. And people who had a sense early on of, oh, the vibes have shifted, everybody's going along with this, I got to go along too.
Right.
Then start increasingly thinking, oh, a lot of this isn't going well, and a lot of people are objecting to this, and I don't want to get on their bad side. And, there will be a future after this. And this goes for a bunch of business leaders of, how strongly do they want to be associated with this when it comes to long-term things? I think law firms are another good example of that. More of them, instead of worrying, Trump attacking us is going to make us lose some corporate clients that we need to work with the government, and instead start worrying things like, if we don't even stand up for ourselves, how can we convince clients we're going to stand up for them? And so there's more of this can add up over time, that things like this growing protests of, I think the Democratic Senator Van Hollen going to El Salvador and getting Abrego Garcia, on TV,
right. And seemed to have worked.
And getting the Salvadorans to admit that the U.S. was paying them to keep him there. That all is valuable, and there's no real way to see where a tipping point is in advance. We never know exactly where that is, where it happens, and they will pretend to be, meaning the administration will pretend to be very popular and acting on the will of the people and calling every poll that says otherwise fake news or anything like that, and they'll keep doing that right up to the point that it doesn't work. But with even some actions of like, how much will they violate a court order versus how much will they adhere to one and maybe try another stretching the law but not outright breaking it path, that public opinion is a constraint on that. It's the sort of thing that they worry about, that they have a sense of, if they lose too much, and I don't know where that number is, I don't think they do either. Maybe he's got to get below 30%, something else, but where they become less able to govern, less able to abuse power, and more people are either resisting or standing up to it. And that is outside of electoral politics.
I think you just made a very, very important point there, because we tend to focus, I think, too much on the elected officials, on Congress. I'm really, at this point, you write them off, but it is the rest of civil society. Will they have a backbone? Will they buy that narrative that resistance is futile? And I think you're going to see that in the law firms, in the private industry, in universities throughout the country. Is it prudent to cave in at this point, because there are no limits to what Donald Trump can do. I mean, let's be honest about it, though. They are facing this unprecedented challenge, an administration that's willing to use all of the levers and cudgels of power, whether it's the FCC or the SEC or potentially the IRS, to go after you, make your life absolutely miserable. So I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I don't think we're at a tipping point yet. Because if anything, I think the Trump folks are going to be more aggressive. I think it was Olivia Troy who pointed out that the Project 2025 agenda was not 100 days. It was like, 150 or 180 days. So we're not there yet, even in terms of their own blueprint. So they're, strap on. Nicholas Grossman, it has been great talking with you. You can read Nicholas's stuff at ARC Digital. He's a professor of political science at the University of Illinois. Nicholas, thanks for coming back on the podcast. We'll have to do this again soon.
Sure, absolutely. My pleasure, Charlie.
And thank you all for listening to today's episode of To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. You know why we do this. You know why we do this multiple times a week, because it's never been more important than it is right now to remind ourselves that we are not the crazy ones. Thanks.